Ready to dive in. Today, we're all about America's wild ride, from Gilded Age excess to the Great Depression. Think Gatsby glamour meets breadlines.
And we've got a fantastic guide in Alberto Lettieri's book, From the Golden Years to the Great Depression, the United States between 1918 and 1945.
Perfect timing, right, because understanding that era feels, well, kind of relevant these days.
It's a fascinating period, no doubt. Lettieri does a great job showing how America went from owing money to being, well, the big kahuna on the block.
Yeah, you don't just become a global superpower overnight, do you?
Not usually, no. But after World War I, things were different. Think about it. Europe's a mess, trying to rebuild. Meanwhile, the U.S. is sitting pretty. And get this, American investments abroad. They went from $3 billion to a whopping $14 billion by 1932. It's kind of mind-blowing.
Talk about a glow up. But like all good things, I'm guessing there's a flip side, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Lettieri makes it clear the sudden economic power that came with strings attached. The old system, where Europe basically traded manufactured goods for raw materials, that went out the window.
So the U.S. is this rising star, and suddenly they're in the spotlight.
Exactly. And they were producing more than ever before, more than they could even use themselves. So what happens? They start selling it, becoming a global economic powerhouse, but it created this huge imbalance. Remember, Europe's still recovering, not exactly buying American products like they used to. And that imbalance, as Lettieri points out, that's a major player in the whole Great Depression story.
Okay, so we've got this economic earthquake brewing. But back in the Roaring '20s, everyone's dancing the Charleston way, that ignorance is bliss and all that.
Well, that's the thing about those times. Lettieri talks about this hands-off approach to government, this idea of laissez-faire economics. Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, they were all about it.
Less government, more good times. Right?
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But Lettieri digs deeper. He argues that those policies, while they sounded good to some, really just benefited the big guys, the big businesses.
So the rich got richer. What else is new, right?
Well, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots got a whole lot wider. Lettieri points to all these mergers happening, companies gobbling each other up. By the end of the 20s, something like 250 banks controlled more than half of all the banking capital.
Wow, talk about putting all your eggs in one basket.
Right. And it wasn't just banking, it was happening everywhere, from retail to manufacturing. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Big companies swallowing up the little guys.
History has a funny way of repeating itself, huh?
Lettieri argues that these policies, things like super low taxes, well, they fueled this whole consolidation trend. And those smaller players, they never really stood a chance.
So while some folks were living the high life, others were getting left behind.
Yeah, and that's a recipe for disaster. Lettieri's really setting the stage here for what's to come.
So we've got this system, this economy teetering on the edge. But what's life actually like for the everyday American during the Roaring '20s?
Well, that's the thing about this era. It's a whirlwind of change and contradictions. Lettieri really brings it to life, all the cultural shifts, women in the workforce, those flapper dresses, jazz music everywhere. It's exhilarating just reading about it.
It's like the old world's being turned upside down.
Exactly. And for the first time, Lettieri argues ordinary people have access to all this stuff, these goods and technologies that were just pipe dreams before.
Cars, radios, even washing machines, right?
It's the dawn of a new era, right? And Lettieri points out it's not just the things themselves, but how they change everyday life. Take electricity, for example. It revolutionized everything.
Suddenly you don't have to spend all day doing chores. More time for dancing the Charleston, I guess.
Exactly. And speaking of revolutions, we can't forget Henry Ford. Lettieri calls him the poster child for mass production, and for good reason.
Model T, the assembly line. He changed everything.
He really did. He took those ideas of scientific management, Taylorism, and said, hold my beer. I mean, the time it took to build a Model T went from 14 hours down to, get this, 1.33 hours?
Get out of here.
Seriously. And the price plummeted too. Ford made car ownership a reality for regular folks.
Okay, so he's a genius, a visionary, but even Ford had his limits, right?
He did. And Lettieri doesn't shy away from that. Ford was so sure that the Model T was all anyone would ever need. He wouldn't adapt. Meanwhile, General Motors comes along offering different models, different styles.
Talk about a missed opportunity.
It's a classic case of adapt or die, even for someone like Henry Ford. And, it's interesting, that same kind of rigidity, that unwillingness to bend, Lettieri argues it affected more than just cars.
What do you mean?
Well, think about all that rapid change happening, the technology, the social norms. It created this clash of values, this tension. especially between rural and urban America.
Yeah, those flapper dresses weren't exactly a hit on every main street.
Exactly. And the radio, for all its wonders, it amplified those divisions. Lettieri talks about how people were suddenly exposed to all these new ideas, different perspectives. It was exciting, but also kind of scary.
It makes you wonder if some of that fear, that resistance to change, is part of what led to the Depression.
It's definitely a factor, and Lettieri doesn't let us forget about the people who were hit hardest during this time, the farmers.
Right, because you'd think with all this progress, agriculture would be booming too.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But Lettieri lays out all these challenges they were facing. Changing diets, for one. People weren't eating as much wheat and corn.
So less demand, lower prices.
And on top of that, World War I ends. Europe doesn't need American farm goods like they used to. So you've got this oversupply, prices are plummeting. It's a recipe for disaster.
And I'm guessing those farmers weren't exactly dancing in Charleston.
Not so much. And Lettieri's point is, their struggles, they're a microcosm of the larger economic problems that are brewing. The cracks are starting to show, even in the midst of all that roaring 20s glitz and glamour.
It's like we can feel it coming, right?
Yeah.
The other shoe about to drop, and then, boom, Black Thursday. Everything changes.
It's hard to overstate how significant this is. Lettieri really gets into the nitty-gritty, the mechanics of it all, and it's not pretty.
I was thinking more like terrifying. We touched on that call loan system earlier.
Yeah.
Lettieri really dives deep on that one.
Yeah, imagine this. You want to buy stocks, but you don't need all the money in front, and you just put down a little, borrow the rest. Short-term loans, crazy high interest rates.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Oh, it gets worse. Lettieri talks about these investment trusts popping up everywhere, promising the moon. They were basically pooling money from everyday people, throwing it into the market.
People just wanted in on the action.
Who wouldn't? But here's the thing. These trusts, they were already leveraged up the wazoo, taking huge risks. Lettieri argues that this whole system, it was basically a house of cards.
And someone took a match to it. October 24th, 1929. What does Lettieri say happened?
It's a perfect storm, really. There was this scandal in London, a big-time fraud case. Investors got spooked, started selling everything they could.
Panic selling? The worst kind.
The bottom falls out. It's brutal. Lettieri doesn't just focus on the numbers, though. He talks about the human cost. Unemployment, breadlines, people losing everything.
It's hard to even imagine that level of despair.
And those who thought the government would step in, they were sorely disappointed. Lettieri tells the story of the Bonus Army. These were World War I vets demanding relief, and they were met with resistance, even violence.
It's a stark reminder of how bad things got. But then FDR comes along, the New Deal. What does Lettieri say about that?
This is where things start to shift. The New Deal was a radical departure. Lettieri argues it signaled a whole new way of thinking about the role of government in the economy.
So no more hands-off approach.
Pretty much. Lettieri details all these programs: the National Recovery Administration, stabilizing prices, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, trying to help farmers. This was government intervention on a scale never seen before.
Were these programs successful, though? I mean, it wasn't all smooth sailing, right?
Lettieri doesn't sugarcoat it. The NRA, for instance, it faced criticism for being too friendly to big business. And the AAA, well, it had some unintended consequences. Farmers destroying crops to drive prices up, not exactly ideal.
Sounds messy. A lot of trial and error.
But here's the key takeaway from Lettieri's work. The New Deal, for all its flaws, it established a crucial precedent. It said the government has a responsibility to help its citizens, to create a safety net, to actively shape the economy.
That's a big deal, a sea change in thinking.
Absolutely. But Lettieri also reminds us that even with the New Deal, it wasn't until World War II, with its massive government spending, that the U.S. truly climbed out of the Depression.
So it took a world war?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Lettieri leaves us with that question. Can capitalism really fix itself after such a massive crisis? Or does it always require something more, something external, to get back on track?
That's a lot to think about, that's for sure. This whole deep dive into Lettieri's work has been incredible. It's amazing how relevant this period of history still feels today, right?
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that we can learn a lot from the past, even when it's full of champagne bubbles and breadlines.
Couldn't agree more. A huge thank you to you and to all our listeners. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and we'll see you for another deep dive soon.